Thank you. I'm going to deviate from the hard sciences a little bit myself because I'm also a layperson. I'm a little bit confused too. But centuries ago, religion was the authority, and science escaped religion and was able to allow free inquiry. And today, the reverse is true, where science is the authority with prestige and esteem, and that's what it's associated with in our Western society. And many would say that religion in the form of intelligent design is merely trying to skirt itself under the umbrella of science in order to have this seal of authenticity. So I'm curious what you think about that. The second part of my question is, why now, as far as it seems like there's such a push recently for intelligent design to get into the schools? And I have my own theory, which I'd love to hear what your theory is, but also I want to know what you think of mine. Recently, science has moved into areas that are ethically controversial, such as stem cell research or cloning or trans-species, engineering, and various kinds of things that humans and animals together and that kind of thing. And so there may be a temptation by some to infuse science with a little bit religion. We also have postmodernism, which has permeated society, and the idea of deconstructing, the idea that there are many truths. So it kind of leaves an opening for intelligent design or religion to kind of move into science, into the classroom. And then also recently we have the Korean researcher that admitted to fraud with respect to cloning studies. So it may seem as if science is vulnerable right now. So I'm just wondering if you think that any of those reasons have any bearing, if that might be why there's this big push, or if there's some other reason that I'm not thinking of, and also if this authority idea has any bearing with respect to why, with religion or intelligent design coming into science.
That's a great question, Charlotte. Are you a sociologist of science or religion, or which?
I actually have a PhD in philosophy.
In philosophy, okay. But it covers everything. Well, I think that it's tempting to see ID as religion masquerading as science, or religion trying to angle in and get scientific prestige. But I think this is really a case of what Mike said, where we just simply don't have categories for this. We have two categories in our cultural understanding of this. We've got science and religion, and we've seen them as being in opposition, dialectical opposition, for over a century. There is an area of overlap. The discussion about the origin of life it's a scientific discussion, but it's incorrigibly philosophical in the sense that it raises big questions.
Right.
And that's as true of a neo-Darwinian view or a self-organizational view as it is of an ID view. So we're in an area of discourse where science and larger worldview or philosophical questions come into they intersect with one another. And I think what is driving the debate, why we're hearing so much about it now, is the reason that Mike alluded to earlier, is that there's so much new information that has been discovered in science, in biology in particular, but also in physics over the last 30 or 40 years about the integrated complexity of the cell and the universe, that the older view that said that the appearance of design was illusory, the Darwinian view, the Dawkins view, is to many of us no longer credible on scientific grounds. Now, having said that, we'll be the first to acknowledge that this whole debate is loaded with these larger implications, but we want to insist that the debate needs to be adjudicated on the basis of the scientific evidence, and we want to allow the implications to kind of be a secondary consideration. I think it does disrespect to civil discourse to say to cast aspersions on someone's argument because of their alleged motives. It would be perfectly improper for me to say that Richard Dawkins is incorrect about design being merely illusory because he happens to be an atheist and has fessed up to the fact that he likes Darwinism because it makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. That's an interesting fact about Richard Dawkins himself, but it would be improper for me to make that a premise in my argument against him. I have to take his scientific proposal seriously, and if I don't like it, I've got to critique it on scientific grounds. So we want to avoid the motive aspect of this and focus on the evidence.
Well, I mean, I personally, even though I'm at the critics table, I actually do believe that intelligent design can be in the classroom, personally. And the reason is because I actually see it more as a philosophy. I don't see it as science, I do see it as philosophy, because I think there's more evidence with respect to Darwinian theory. But I think that it's good to incorporate philosophy into science, into the science classroom, and because it, it gives a synthesis, a big picture, putting various disciplines together so the students can understand better. But I'm curious, if you want ID in the classroom, where would you draw the line? Because someone could say that there's a slippery slope. What are you going to allow in the classroom if other theories, maybe some very outlandish theories, Scientology, for example, when it was first formulated, they wanted to make it a science. And they decided it was not advantageous to do so. So instead they went as a religion. But one thing they believe is that humans were carried to Earth and blown up in volcanoes 76 million years ago. Now, would that be something that, because I'm sure they could come up with some reasons that they think are very good. And I'm just wondering about, and even all of you may have different ideas as to what intelligent design is. Which theory would be taught? All of the theories? And then outside of that, what theories would be taught. So I'm just kind of curious about the line you would draw and, its place in the classroom.
I've got a colleague that you may know, John Angus Campbell, a professor of the rhetoric of science. And his proposal is that we should teach the important controversies that arise in science, whether about stem cell research or global warming or certainly this controversy, because for one, it fosters civil discourse, and we can learn to enjoy friendship across divides such as the one we're having here tonight, but also that our surest protection against really nutty ideas is argumentation and subjecting ideas to critical scrutiny. So not every idea should be taught for the simple reason that society and teachers and students aren't interested in every idea. But goodness, this idea has been recently on the front page of the New York Times and Time Magazine. It's everywhere. If a student brings in Michael Behe's best-selling book and wants to know what the biology teacher thinks of it, do we really have to say that the biology teacher must muzzle himself or herself? We think that's a bad proposal for civil discourse.
If I could add to that, I don't think anyone at this table advocates requiring intelligent design in the science classroom. I know I don't. The Discovery Institute doesn't. It's premature at least. But we would also advocate, I think, that if the topic comes up, it should be discussed openly. People shouldn't be penalized for discussing it. Now, let me add to that, intelligent design is already mandated in the biology classroom because it's in the textbooks. The textbooks, and I have a dozen of them that do this, including some fairly recent ones like 2005, include sections on intelligent design, but they misrepresent it and they bash it. Now, they've brought it into the classroom. We didn't. Is it going to be discussed fairly on a level playing field, or are the rules different for the visitors?
May I give an example of that? May I have my slide 22, please?
Eternal optimist.
While we're waiting for the slide, I want to elaborate on what Jonathan said. Much of the evolutionary biology literature already concerns itself with intelligent design. Here, this is George Williams, who is a distinguished neo-Darwinian theoretician at the State University of New York. Could you advance it, please? Once more. This is a text that one could use constitutionally in any public school classroom in the United States. It's a monograph that he wrote on natural selection. Actually, it would probably be too advanced for a high school class, but certainly a teacher could bring it in. Next slide. Now, here's an argument from that book. Advance it one more, please. This is a vertebrate eye with its distinctive retinal structure here. One more, advance, please. Williams says, I'll tell you how I know that evolution has occurred. If you look at the vertebrate retina, the photoreceptors, the cells that actually interact with photons in the retina, are oriented away from incoming light, so that as light is passing through the lens to contact the retina, the photoreceptors are facing backwards, so the photon has to pass through a few layers before it actually reaches the business end of the photoreceptor. As a consequence of that, there's a blind spot because the wiring for these cells comes out onto the surface of the retina, and to get back to the brain, all these nerves have to collect together here, And at that spot, there are no photoreceptors, hence you have a blind spot. So Williams says, why would a wise designer do that? Surely the right thing to do would be to turn the photoreceptors around so that the wiring could come back, go out the back of the eye, and you wouldn't have a blind spot, as is the case in the eyes of cephalopods, like an octopus. Now, imagine that you're a high school biology student and you read this argument and you want to evaluate it on its merits in the classroom. Raise the question in class. George Williams says the vertebrate eye is stupidly designed, ergo we evolved. Can we talk about this? Now, the teacher, under our current constitutional situation, faces a real dilemma. She can tell the student, no, you have to accept George Williams' authority, or she can say, yes, let's have a debate about the intelligent design of the eye. Intelligent design is already in the biological literature in this form. And intellectual fairness would say any student in a public school classroom in the United States, because the arguments are already there in the literature, should have the freedom to evaluate them and not have to accept the authority of George Williams. After all, that's why we have science, because people can get things wrong.
Moreover, there are good counter-arguments, evidence-based counter-arguments, the work of George Ayub explaining why the eye is optimally designed is a matter of a constrained optimization, he says, where the slight flaw you might find in it because of the blind spot is compensated for by the overall design whereby many other parameters are optimized. And so he says this is a good example of constrained optimization, a very good design.
But even to bring that up, Steve, one would need to say, yes, we can have a debate about intelligent design because it's already there in the scientific literature.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to just answer your question, Charlotte, by commending your colleagues from to your left at Cal State. Because I've seen the syllabus that Jim Hoffman uses. It's been on the internet in various forms. And I think that's the way to do it. I mean, these guys are obviously not advocates of ours, but I'm confident that they present our arguments fairly. They assign the appropriate readings. They allow students to evaluate the arguments and ideas for themselves. That may be at this point. That may be at this point most appropriate at the college level, but I think it certainly provides a model for constructive discourse and shows how you can discuss a controversial issue in a way. My colleague John Campbell says we want to harness all these metaphysical tensions in service of good pedagogy. You know, that students are actually energized and interested by these competing perspectives, and it gives them more of a reason to know their biology.
Let me shift here to, time flies when you're having fun, really. Dr. Herber, you had your hand up earlier, so definitely.
I have a really important item about tiger's eye. Science does make mistakes, and in fact, the first guy who described that in about 1893 was all wet, and that just came out recently too. No, that's kind of a halfway joke. Just 2 points. You mentioned that you rely on uniformitarianism to some extent because it was practiced in the past, and that certainly is correct in the 1800s, and it was very useful. But uniformitarianism in those days is a little different than what we think of today. In those days, not only were they used the phrase, the present is the key to the past, and that's fine, but they also thought that rates were like they are today, and that was a mistake. So I'd just like to bring up the second point, that the science to this regard is also self-correcting. And a fellow who thought that the rates were the same as well as the processes took this on, and his name was Lord Kelvin. Thomson, the greatest physicist probably of the 1800s. And so what he did, he started to calculate the age of the Earth. And throughout time, he got somewhere between about 30 million and 400 million years. Well, his 30 million years wasn't enough for the geologists at the time to decide the length of time, either that it takes for evolution or for many of the processes that they saw. But he hung on to that idea till about 1890 when Rutherford and some of the folks discovered radioactivity. But he calculated the age of the Earth based on how long it should cool. well, it turns out the Earth really isn't cooling that much because of radioactivity. But he didn't know about it. So science is very much self-correcting. Then there's another example, kind of goes in the reverse. In the 1920s, a fellow by the name of J. Harlan Bretz, University of Washington, he discovered some phenomenal features extending all the way from Idaho through Washington, through Oregon, along the Columbia River. And he got sand dunes, for example, and ripple marks that were miles long. Nobody's ever seen anything like that up to that time. Of course, now we see them in the solar system elsewhere, all the time with about every third photo. Anyhow, he went to a Geological Society of America meeting. He was fairly famous for coming up with that idea. And another fellow by the name of James Galooly, who was one of the gods, small letter, in the U.S. Geological Survey, really took him to task. And he took him to task on the basis of uniformitarianism. He said, this can't be correct because you're talking about catastrophism. And one of the items that was brought up was there's a 30-ton boulder sitting 400 feet above the Columbia River today that was inexplicable at the time. Well, this fellow finally came up with the idea of these massive Missoula glacial floods. And they just flooded essentially half states, in a matter of a couple of days. Eventually, James Galooly came around because we soon got air photographs. We could actually see all these things. And so he relented and he agreed that this was a water-borne type process. But again, science was self-correcting, in both those two examples. But it takes time.
Those are great examples. By referring to uniformitarianism, I'm using the popular name that doesn't, the modern name would be actualism. That's just referring to the idea of
Correct.
similar causes, not necessarily committing to similar rates. So that's a good distinction. But our concern is about what happens to the self-correcting nature of science if you have a methodological rule that prevents you from considering a hypothesis that might be true. What if it is true that life was designed by an intelligence? And science is saying the opposite. Could science ever be corrected when it also holds a rule that says you can't consider the possibility of design?
I suppose I would disagree that scientists say either of those two on the average.
Well,
Not in my experience.
welcome to our world. This methodological naturalism is wagged at us on a regular basis, and we think if you hold that firmly, you couldn't. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, the universe really is designed. Would you ever be able to tell as a scientist if you held that rule that you couldn't consider the possibility of design as a hypothesis? Clearly you couldn't, and therefore science is not in that condition, in that case, self-correcting.
It seems to me that one of the concerns you might want to focus on, though, is the fact that design can be used in different ways. And this brings to mind a question that I have is, why does the notion of design, and this is something that Keith brought up earlier, and a similar kind of posing, why does the notion of design promoted by the ID movement necessarily exclude the notion of design that many other Christians accept as the result of God's implementation of the evolutionary process? Because they would say that there is design, but it's not quite the same kind of way you're talking about design. How do you discuss that, or how do you address that?
Can I jump in?
Sure.
I would say, that's fine. You can have design, God can do whatever he wants. If he wanted to make life through one way or another way, who am I to tell him differently?
Sure.
I'm a Roman Catholic. I went to parochial schools. I learned Darwin's theory in parochial schools, and we were told that God.
How about Catholic theology?
I learned that too. But I just want to make the point that
let me see your hands.
I just want to make the point that that's what I used to think. I used to think, God made the laws of the universe, which went on to produce life. Isn't that cool? That's really neat.
But that's interesting that you would say that Catholic theology has sort of shaped some of your mentality, because it's in the loudest voice that I think I've read as a theologian that Catholics speak quite loudly about the fact that they can't embrace intelligent design on a theological basis because it talks about a God from behind or a God of the past, instead of one that lures creation toward a novel position.
Oh, that's John Hott. You're talking.
Well, sure it is. And John Hott is very
You should read Cardinal Ratzinger's op-ed piece.
I have.
In the New York Times.
I have.
Yeah.
And it was also, commented on by Father Coyne of the Vatican Observatory that, B16, as we call them all sometimes in Catholic circles, has, a very limited understanding in some of these areas, and he was clarified by what the Vatican really was trying to say through, the voice of this scientific arm. And I don't think that there is as much credibility given to intelligent design in Catholic circles as you're implementing, because of the way in which they take their pound of flesh and they look at their pound of flesh. You're saying that in many ways, the way in which you approach the science is without religion, but I think that it's like the Merchant of Venice. You can't have flesh without blood, and I don't think you can have your science without some kind of preconceived bias. And I think we all walk in with that. That's not bad. It's not good. It just is. And I think that the bias that I find happening, in the intelligent design community, is that it comes from anticipating a certain way of looking at the way God is. And it's not, it's almost a proprietorship of understanding that God could only be seen in this
Well,
one
I
certain way.
disagree. I used to think that, as you said, God worked one way, but I looked at the evidence, and that's what changed my mind. But John has something to say here.
A question to you. Have you read The Origin of Species?
Yes.
So you know that in it, Darwin frequently argues in the following manner. Such and such must be the case because on a theory of creation, it would not have happened that way. God would not have done it that way. Darwin himself argues often that his theory is right because God wouldn't have done it that way. So if we're talking about bringing in religious preconceptions, they're right there in Darwin.
Sure, and there are other preconceptions that Darwin talks about too, where according to the American Museum of Natural History, one of the lectures that just currently came out of that body identified perhaps a different way of looking at Darwin, that he today would probably be considered a theistic evolutionist and not someone who is necessarily completely opposed to the way in which some theistic evolutionists look at evolution today. And it wouldn't have anything to do with necessarily the same voice that comes from the intelligent design community.
Let me ask another, maybe it's not a question. Should the origin of species be allowed in a science class? Because after all, it does discuss what God would or would not have done.
I think that would be a very good way of putting students to sleep, because if you've read the whole thing, you know how tedious it is.
I agree with you
But
there.
I think that what you're getting at here is a very, very big difference here that we have to express. And that,
Well, the difference is this. When you look at other sciences...
Let me finish my point. What I'm trying to say is that if you're going to be presenting data from a normative perspective instead of a descriptive perspective, well, perhaps some of the things in the origin of species shouldn't be talked about. But if you're going to be doing it strictly to describe what the voice of Darwin said in that book, I think it's fine, and I don't think you'd have anybody clamoring, on your doorstep saying that you're saying something that's wrong, because you're not taking a position, you're just describing what he said. And I think that would be fine to use what his descriptions might have said if it included something about a deity in a public school, because you're not breaking any laws.
Well, actually, I have a 2005 textbook, a college textbook, widely used by Douglas Fatuma. Evolution is the title.
Sure.
And he has a section in it called Evidence for Evolution. And he uses exactly the same argument. Evolution is true because God wouldn't have done it that way. That's a science textbook.
Sure, and I think that if you have a responsible professor or teacher, you would point out that, is that truly science? Is it science to be an atheist? Is it science to be a Christian? Well, no, it's not. And I think that when you talk in terms of blending those two together and calling one the other, then you have a problem.
I agree.
So if I was to comment to a student who said, well, this person is bringing an atheistic perspective and he's linking it to evolution, I would ask him, did he prove that scientifically? Just as I would somebody who has a religious perspective like I believe that the intelligent design community is linked to. I think that you can't jettison your religious perspective if
But
you
I'm
really
talking-
The
believe
point
it.
is, he's making a religious argument in favor of evolutionary theory, and that there's been a long-standing tradition of doing that from Darwin right to the present. It's part of the structure of the argument for Darwinian evolution. If that's a permissible form of argumentation, then surely challenging those religiously loaded propositions and premises should be fair game.
Also, you didn't hear that kind of argument from the intelligent design theorists here. We can argue for intelligent design as a given, I mean not as a given, as a feature of the living world, without appealing to what God would or would not have done. But Darwin consistently does that.
May
Now,
I,
where is the religion here?
may I have my slide 20, please? I actually think that Professor Nelson, great last name, has touched on a central issue. When students are asked to evaluate evolutionary theory, the arguments and evidence that they're being asked to evaluate historically have been entangled with theology. Here's one example of countless, well not countless, many examples in the Origin. This is Darwin, very close to the end of the book, making a case for why you should accept his view. And he's appealing to your theological intuitions. He says it makes more sense for a wise creator to have built the world not directly by special creation, but rather by using the laws that he put in place. This is from the Origin. Now, I was on a debate on National Public Radio with a philosopher of science who opposes intelligent design, and I asked him directly, would you teach the origin of species in a public high school biology classroom? And he said no. He wouldn't allow it in, precisely because he knew about passages like this, where the argument depends on the assumption that Darwin is making about the nature of the creator. If you take the Origin, you can do this online, and search for the words creation, creator, created, you'll get dozens of hits, because the whole structure of the argument in the Origin is to say, God would have done this, yet we observe that. What should one conclude? So I would say that even to teach evolutionary theory properly, you must give students the freedom to evaluate arguments like this, but according to the federal judge in Dover, you're not allowed to do that, and I think that's just crazy.
Let me wrap. We're running out of time. Let me take one more question from the panel. Dr. Flew, Keith Morrison, anyone? Question?
I just wanted to add a point about this question of religion in the classroom. And to say that I think a lot of people share that view, that there is a kind of a dysfunction about the way we've handled this constitutional question of teaching religion in the classroom. I have a feeling that the Constitution wasn't written the way it was in order to keep out the question of whether or not there's a God or anything else. It was written there to keep out a legal requirement that the country would follow a certain specific religion. The irony of the circumstances we're in now, and it's neither good nor bad, it's simply an irony, is that it's one specific religion which is demanding a change to the Constitution. The rest of them, by and large, are satisfied with it the way it is. At least that's merely observation on my part. I personally think that it's reprehensible that people in this country are as poorly educated about religion as they are, and they should be much better educated. And when issues came along like this, they could probably put them into context rather than getting too excited about them.
John, out of courtesy to one of our colleagues, would it be all right if we allowed Guillermo? We've had questions from the other side about what kind of research follows from the intelligent design approach. Guillermo has a wonderful book that he's written, Privileged Planet. He's got ongoing research developing his hypothesis that's being published in technical journals. I wonder if we could just give him a minute to describe what he does.
Okay.
Yeah. 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, at least I get to say something. Well, basically, I set out a new hypothesis in the book Privileged Planet with my co-author, Jay Richards, who's a philosopher and a theologian, and it's based on just a discovery, something that I just stumbled upon one day after I came back from watching an eclipse in India. And that's that the conditions you need for life in the universe overlap or correlate with the conditions that you need for scientific discovery. And so, in other words, if you make a list of all the factors you need for life on a planet on a ledger on one side, and on the other side, you make a list of the conditions that are favorable to a wide range of scientific discoveries, you find that there's substantial overlap between the two. So if you have one, you have the other. And that's a surprise, that these two things should correlate. In other words, the most habitable planets in the universe also afford its inhabitants the best opportunities for scientific discovery of the universe. And this is true all the way from observing solar eclipses all the way to cosmology. And for example, in cosmology, it appears that this is the best time in the history of the universe to be a cosmologist. And that's not me saying that. That was actually in a refereed paper published in Physics Letters B in October 2004, 6 months after my book was published. So independently confirming one of my chapters in the book that it's actually the best time in the history of the universe because we can measure, for example, the cosmic microwave background radiation. Some of you may have seen the latest results from WMAP that came back from this NASA satellite that's measuring the relic radiation from the early era of the universe, which is the most important confirmation of the Big Bang theory that Behe brought up earlier. But it turns out this is the best time to actually measure that radiation, and it's actually the most important thing that cosmologists measure today is the microwave background radiation. So there are a number of research projects that are resulting from my thesis, and there's lots of potential thesis projects in this book for aspiring graduate students, again in cosmology, to quantify just how close are we to the best time in the history of the universe to be a cosmologist, to studying things having to do with habitability. There's a lot of astrobiology that I cover in the book. In fact, my specialty nowadays is astrobiology, so I study extrasolar planets, and I developed the concept called the galactic habitable zone, which is a calculation of the most favorable locations in the galaxy to have life. And for example, for those of you who may have been keeping up with extrasolar planets research, there's something most people haven't really been talking about in that area. So far, about 170 planets have been found around other stars. That's a remarkable new development in astronomy. It's one of the most exciting new research areas, the study of planets around other stars. It's amazing we can measure that and detect them. But what's being found is that these other planets are very different from those in our solar system. They have very different orbits. They're highly eccentric. And other astronomers who are involved in doing these searches, such as Marcy and Butler at Berkeley, have said that the solar system looks weird, and now that's pretty clear from the evidence. So I said that about 5 years ago, actually, and it's nice that they're finally agreeing with me. So this is the kind of research I do, and there's lots of potential for testing a number of the evidences that I put forth in the book, and so I look forward to other research astronomers and astrobiologists to take my ideas with them and do research projects. And so certainly it opens new doors to ask questions like, why is it the best time in the history of the universe to be a cosmologist? That's the kind of question that wouldn't come naturally to somebody who doesn't subscribe to ID, in my opinion.
Sorry, Guillermo. He's the... I have a panel of critics who are philosophers and biochemists, geologists, and no astrophysicist to go with you there. Sorry.
That's all right.
This means we have to do this again. We're running out of time. We've run out of time. I've gone into overtime play here. But as you can see, this is a huge debate. There's issues in science, astrophysics, philosophy, religion, and so on. And this really does need to continue. We need to do this again. Maybe at Cal State Fullerton to pick a neutral place then for that. So, But I thought I'd allow myself as the moderator to be selfish, okay, and ask one question myself of the panelists, and you can all answer this briefly, okay, which is, what do you think it would take for intelligent design to be widely accepted in scientific circles?
Well, I'll begin with a short stab at it. It's going to ruin my reputation because I'm actually going to agree with Bruce Weber.
Ruin his too.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think of that. What will it do to my reputation? You said earlier that what intelligent design needs to do is prove to be fruitful scientifically, and I completely agree. We're actually working on that. I think we're making good progress on it, and I'm very optimistic about it. It's premature to mention details, but there are people around the country, actually around the world, actively doing research guided by the intelligent design framework. So all I can say is...
Jonathan, tell about your paper on cancer research.
Really?
Yeah, briefly.
Briefly.
Briefly. Well, one example, let's see if I can put this in one sentence. I developed a hypothesis about something going on in the cell during cell division that, if it turns out to be true, it's a testable hypothesis. If it turns out to be true, it could shed light on some early steps in the development of cancer. I plan to do active experiments on this later this year. I could be wrong, but I do think if I can't do it, somebody will be able to show that intelligent design leads to fruitful research.
There's a direct application of the concept of irreducible complexity and design as a guide to discovery.
It's making a very risky prediction about something in the cell that hitherto has been poorly understood and poorly studied. And I'm making a very radical proposal about how it functions that can be tested. And if the theory is correct, then we'll learn something. Anyway, the best I can say is I'm optimistic, and stay tuned. And if we win, we win. Let's have lunch in 10 years. And if I win, you buy. If you...
So, other panelists.
I agree with Jonathan and also with Bruce that the scientists that I know are intensely pragmatic. What they want to see are results. New discoveries, new knowledge. And I think if intelligent design leads to new knowledge, that the scientific community will vote with their feet. Whatever their philosophical or theological reservations, they'll say, you guys made that discovery, we didn't expect that, there's something to what you're doing. So I would agree that that is a necessary task, that intelligent design has to lead to new knowledge.
I, in a way, don't agree with that. I think design is fruitful, and there are predictions that design makes that a Darwinian model doesn't make. I've mentioned the difference in predictions about the age of the type 3 secretory system versus the bacterial flagellum. I can think of other examples, such as the debate about junk DNA, whether it's functional or not functional. A design perspective and a Darwinian perspective would be very different there. And there's been an article recently about how neo-Darwinism has been very unfruitful heuristically. It led us in a blind alley by causing us to think that these non-coding regions of the genome were junk when we hold that a design perspective would predict the opposite. But the theory of intelligent design, like its Darwinian counterpart, is a theory about the history of life and how things arose. And historical theories are tested primarily by their ability to explain already known facts. And I think on that score, intelligent design has already been very successful. Its explanation, for the example, the origin of information or the origin of irreducibly complex systems, I think is clearly superior based on what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world. So that's a successful historical scientific theory. It may lead to further fruitful research in science. I think it will. But I think it's already attracting a following among the next generation of scientists. And one thing we've learned from the great historian of science and philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, is that scientific revolutions are not won in the first blush of conflict, while all the people who are established in their positions suddenly rush to a new idea. But they're usually won after those retirements, and as younger people come along who are caught up in the excitement about the new idea and what it can explain and what it predicts that other theories don't. And based on our email traffic, there's a lot of interest in people who are postdocs, pre-docs, undergraduates and high school age. And I think that's where what it will take for intelligent design to win, which is to capture that younger generation of scientists, and we're very optimistic on that score.
I agree more with Steve than these other jokers. It's nice to make a prediction or something like that, but reality doesn't necessarily say that it's going to allow you to make a prediction. The question is, Does this idea explain what we see? And I think the most important thing to get people in general, and scientists as well, is the future results of especially the biological sciences as a whole. From where I sit, the cell has gotten a whole lot more complex than 10 years ago when we started ID in earnest. And, you know, now proteins are known not to exist mostly as single polypeptides, but in complexes of a half dozen or more. Now there are new systems for controlling genes that nobody knew of before. And I see no reason that that's going to decrease. The cell's going to get more and more and more and more complex. Here's a bold prediction. Darwinism is going to continue to be unable to explain it. And I think, as Steve says, that as more students, one important thing that hasn't been mentioned is that now ID is in the public eye. And so students who are coming up will have heard about it and will, when they go into their classes, their lectures, and their instructors describe for them the enormously complex systems that run the cell, they're going to have in the back of their mind, you know, okay, how do you really explain this through Darwinian processes? And when they don't get a good answer, I think more and more will be persuaded of ID, even if it doesn't make, you know, some stunning discovery. So I'll give it 10, 20 years.
Still a prediction.
Yeah, that's a prediction.
I have nothing really new to add. To say that there's also astronomy research that could help here, and so I encourage all aspiring young astronomy graduate students to consider this seriously.
It's the best time, too, right?
Before it's too late. Right?
That's right.
Well, thank you, guys.
Too late.
And I especially want to thank the critics for coming tonight. Thank you. I don't know if you saw or read some of the blogs that were going on the web, how this discussion this evening got some national attention I wasn't quite expecting it to get. But some of these people took some real heat for even coming to Biola, you know. So really, really appreciate it. In fact, I'd like to give them a standing ovation for coming here tonight. So please, thank you. From my Old Testament background, the Jews will say next year in Jerusalem. Maybe next year at Cal State Fullerton. So, thank you and good night.